Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce somebody that I know very dear to our hearts in the Python community, Dr. David Mertz. He doesn't like to say he's a doctor, but this guy is a PhD holder, Dr. David Mertz. So to introduce him, David is a principal engineer for Service Employees International Union. He created the data science training program for Anaconda Inc. Who knows Anaconda? Who remembers? Yep, among other companies. With the advent of deep neural networks, he has turned to training our robot overlords as well. Earlier, David helped build the world's fastest, highly specialized supercomputer for performing molecular dynamics. Woo! Well done, sir. Well done. Well done. David was also a director of the PSF for 6 years and remains the co-chair up to today of the Trademarks Committee and the Scientific Python Working Group. His columns, Charming Python and XML Matters, written in year 2000. How old was I? Written in year 2000, were the most widely read articles in the Python world. He has written previous books for Manning, Packett, O'Reilly, and Addison Wesley, and has given keynote addresses at numerous international programming conferences. So please, you know how we do it in Nigeria way. You know how we used to hey, you know how we used to vibe. Welcome David Mertz to the stage for his keynote. That's the Nigeria welcome.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Wonderful. If we have time, I'd love to open up the discussion, but I'll see how I go in making my comments. I'm humbled to be invited to this place where we are speaking together. I know that this city where I am talking to you became a city created by the Awari Yoruba people in what we call the 15th century of the Western and Christian calendar. I know that this place was called Iko under the administrative domain of the Kingdom of Benin from the 16th century. I know also that it was later branded as Onim and later Lagos by Portuguese merchants whose successors were the war criminals of the transatlantic slave trade, beginning in the 17th century. I know that at the start of the 19th century, the British Empire sought, by means of violence, both to end the enslavement of human beings in Lagos and elsewhere, and to impose imperialist control of resources and human beings under a capitalist system rather than de jure enslavement. I know that by the time the now nation of Nigeria gained a degree of independence in 1954 and independence in October 1960, Lagos was a diverse city across ethnic, religious, linguistic, gender, class, and other dimensions. And of course, I know that this place is home to many friends and brilliant colleagues, present and future, some of whom write Python code. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. The tradition of land acknowledgement, something like what I just started with, but I have another agenda here, is common among progressive speakers in areas where colonialism has displaced and often murdered indigenous people. Speaking here, where I am in this city at this podium, is not the same as speaking in the United States where I live. And place cannot have entirely the same insinuations. What it means to belong to Lagos differs from what it means to belong to Los Angeles, for example. In acknowledging my place, I have necessarily cast a net over many identities. We each belong to many communities, some voluntarily and volitionally, others that feel inevitable and immutable. Benedict Anderson's lovely 1991 book, which is, I'm sure, too small for you to read in that picture, but again, you can refer to the online thing. It's meant a great deal to me. It was important, for example, in my dissertation in philosophy. While I won't, well, this is a joke, but while I won't encourage copyright violation, I do wonder if a PDF of his 2006 reprint of the second edition exists online. See my document online, you'll find where it is. In this admittedly dense text, Anderson looked at how, by imagining nations, their subjects and citizens become able to imagine themselves as reflections of such a national community. Many identities work in a similar way, and the communities with which we identify become something more than simply an enumeration of the people belonging to them. These bullets, if you can see them, perhaps look like interview boasts. I mean, Aisha already did it for me and said these same things, but that's not my goal here. I've already been invited to this stage. There are people in this room who are more important than I am to the Python language, and indeed, who are more important to the Python community. There are still more of you who will become so in the future. However, I've been in this community and close enough to it for long enough to see the Python community become an identity that feels close to the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people in the world, perhaps to millions. In 1998, and even in 2008, Python was simply a useful technical tool, as it remains exclusively so for many people. However, somewhere around that latter date, it became also something that people belonged to, a community. What changed, and what does it mean for a community to come into existence generally? The earliest meeting of Python developers was in November 1994. This low-resolution photograph is the best I could find. I can make out several people I know and a few others I can guess about. You can make out even fewer because the screen projection and so on. 30 years ago, when this photo was taken, before I had myself heard of Python, I would describe Python as an idea, perhaps as an incipient doctrine. The Zen of Python was yet to be written. Discussions about the programming language occurred on the Usenet, but were predominantly about technical design questions and rarely, if ever, about community or identity. Only uncommonly were they even about the philosophy of the Python language. At a glance, even in low resolution, we can see that these 9 people were able-bodied, 30-something white men. Most are Americans, with 2 or 3 Europeans. All were highly educated and economically comfortable. I do not wish even remotely to suggest that early Pythonistas were messianic or that our Python community is itself a religion. Nonetheless, at about the same age as these men, Siddhartha and Jesus and Mohammed, peace be upon him, each had a small number of associates who were demographically similar to each other and who were motivated by an idea before their religious communities emerged. This analogy can be productive. I'm not going to read the Durkheim quote there. If you can see it, good, but if not, I'm going to make comments around it. I want to lean into this metaphor of religious identity just slightly more. Of course, I recognize that our Python community and other programming language communities are also very different from religious identities in many concrete and profound ways. For me and for many others, the Python community has become a source of joy, inner peace, serenity, and enthusiasm, which is in Emil Durkheim's quote that's on screen. It's something I have come to identify with deeply, and something that I continually recreate by actions such as giving talks like this. In a small way, everyone participating in this conference is creating and recreating communities around Python, around region and nation, around open source, and in the complex web of affinities and identifications. My identification is because of my biographical journey in part. However, my identification is also because of what Python has become as a social entity. Something with qualities and values that conform with my own, but also that simultaneously shape my own. A similar positive entity has developed among communities and formal organizations attached to other programming languages. I think Python has often led the way in these social aspects, and many communities that are not those surrounding Python lack some of the beliefs and practices that I value. I imagine that I am much like the rest of the people in this room in my values. To be clear, in what I just said, I imagine, I am not simply rhetorically stating that this is a fact, but rather I'm describing my relationship to this imagined community, which perhaps is similar to other people's such relationship. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a variety of new religions were created. In the United States, the Latter-day Saints emerged in 1830, the Unity Church in 1891, and Scientology in 1954. In Iran, Babism began in 1844, evolving into the Baha'i faith in 1863. In Korea, we saw Dongkok in 1860 and the 20th century offshoot Chendenism. This list is not exhaustive, of course. In social dynamic, during their first years, these new religious movements often resembled the major world religions mentioned a few moments ago. In theology and doctrine, of course, they have differed significantly from earlier traditions. It sometimes happens that someone identifies with the theological tenets of a new religion and joins for that reason. But I believe it is far more common that membership follows our social perception of the communities and the social networks we join. Over the last 35 years or so, since free software and open source have become articulated and compelling doctrines, many programming languages have been created, many of which could have early photographs akin to that I showed of 30-something aged Python creators from 1994. Free software has articulated a good collection of tenets, not always perfect, and commonly enough with distinctly toxic threads as well, but far better than its opposites. With the ideas of free software have often the ideas of free software have often been resisted by proprietary technology companies, the Microsofts and the Oracles and Apples and Teslas and SAPs and Adobes of the world. These good ideas, nonetheless, have generally won the world. Nearly nothing that runs on computers does so without using somewhere between a lot and entirely free software. I do not want to disparage other technical communities. It would be both outside of my direct experience and show an unnecessary lack of respect. Of course, one introduces that to walk it back. That said, in my experience among varying technical communities, there are things that make some less appealing to me. Technology significantly locked under the control of private corporations are rarely ones with which I can identify. Yet, yes, I might still use some of those tools of necessity or after weighing technical trade-offs, but I will never feel membership in their communities in the same way as I do for this Python community or these Python communities. Sadly also, many projects in the world of open source are infected with a Silicon Valley tech bro libertarian ideology. I'm not sure how equally familiar that sounds here as it does where I live, but it's a tendency of this stereotype that's often true. While the open source aspect is good, and while communities are something more than their founding individuals, the toxic beliefs of core contributors can often leak into a much less inclusive attitude in the ensuing community. I hope that the world outside of my US lens is much less a victim of the worship of laissez-faire and belief in a fantasized meritocracy. I'm here in a place I have not previously been, and perhaps I can learn from those here what values, experiences, hopes, and social structures my colleagues here experience and what you hope for. Python does not suffer these pitfalls that I somewhat enumerated above, or at least it usually does not. Or at least in its best aspects, it does not. There are footnotes coming up. We have the nice PyLadies logo and a bit of the standard blurb about it. I was present for several of the doctrine shaping changes that led to our current Python communities. I did not realize at the time how important these apparently small actions actually were, but I am delighted by their outcomes. The next few things I say will skew towards the role of the Python Software Foundation as the nominal official administrative arm of the Python community. I recognize that this is limited. One particular US nonprofit is not the same thing as diverse and flourishing communities in many nations, regions, cities, technical areas, and social backgrounds. By chance, I knew the initial founders of PyLadies in 2008, who were in Los Angeles, where I lived at the time. I helped smooth over some initial personality conflicts in that first chapter. A bit later, I helped bring the brand and the organization under PSF fiscal sponsorship. PyLadies, as most of you are surely aware, has gone on to have hundreds of chapters and events, and so many wonderful members of our and its community have promoted equality and opportunity. PyLadies has become an institutionalized part of what it means to use and belong to Python, whether or not you as an individual attend or organize its events. The presence of this doctrinal trend is part of our identities in belonging to the Python community. We all know the Zen of Python. Here I've excerpted it a bit with some ellipses. Our dogma in the Python world is infused with humor. Tim Peters' Zen of Python is rich with ideas about what makes our language what it is. But it also breaks the fourth wall, as one says of cinema sometimes. And it has a literary richness. We can hear the winks when reading it. The mixed metaphor is, of course, deliberate. The naming of projects, companies, libraries, and the like often carry this joking quality. And much of what many of us find joy in within these communities of Python is this humor. Only during the writing of this talk did I find a comment on a bug tracker by Tim from that same year of 2008 that I am treating as a transition year. A contributor suggested that the inconsistent use of dashes in the Zen was a mistake. And Tim replied, I love to quote him in my books and talks and things like that. This is his comment on this bug tracker. I'm afraid you missed the joke. While you believe spaces are required on both sides of an M dash, there is no consensus on this point. For example, most, but not all American authorities say no spaces should be used. That's the joke. In writing a line about only one way to do it, I used a device, M dash, for which at least two ways to do it, with spaces and without spaces, are commonly used, neither of which is obvious, and deliberately picked a third way just to rub it in. I need to be as pedantic as Tim if I am able to. Tim is only partially right, for what it's worth. While indeed M dashes should have no space around them, N dashes always should, and neither should be confused with a hyphen. That's my typography obsession. There's been some events in our community, and I want to talk about a few of them. These have to do with the nature of groups, of societies, of communities, but they're illustrated in specifics about events that have happened in the Python world. I don't know if you can read this, but the thing on screen is a bit of the mission statement of the diversity statement from 2009. Python's communities have been self-conscious of what it means to be a community, but we have not been univocal. In 2009, the PSF's diversity statement, followed a little bit later by our code of conduct, were quite divisive. Many Python users and developers angrily resisted an enshrinement of diversity and inclusion. Some left altogether. In their minds, and I think I can reasonably characterize many of these prominent voices, since many have been my close friends, it was wrong to make Python about social values, and only right to concern ourselves with the technical merits and language or library design choices. I supported and helped author the diversity statement and the code of conduct. that is now used in all Python branded conferences. While it is fortunately rare that the COC needs to be used, I believe its presence has contributed to inclusivity. And, Aisha read it right here at the beginning, and it's in your pamphlet and everything else. I believe that some of my friends were wrong ideologically and politically. And I'm proud to have voted as a PSF director to enact these foundational social documents. Many other technical and programming languages communities have followed similar principles to those that have created the Python community, but Python was one of the first to get there. So now I actually get to show you some code. I kind of hope you can read it, but I apologize if you can't. I'll explain, though, in my description what I think is going on there. Social structures are not fixed over time, but to some degree, Python's ethical obligations to strive for inclusivity was decided in 2008 and 2009. And this has become a persistent aspiration for our communities. This attitude, albeit imperfectly enacted, and sometimes blind to wider global realities outside a privileged technocratic elite, has endured. But Python is, after all, a programming language. Sometimes technical issues divide people as well. The code I show on this slide looks a great deal different than anything I could have written in 2003 or 2008. It's more or less a snippet of code I genuinely wrote in the last few months. There's some cleanup and adjustments from the code that's actually in the stuff I'm working on, but it's close to this. In 2014, type annotations were added by PEP 484. In 2015, coroutines spelled with await and async were introduced. Both of these are large changes, and both occupy a large part of the code surface in the snippet you see. You see all those constructs, the type annotations and the await and the async and stuff like that, and that's sort of essential to the way we look at code often nowadays. Many Python developers, and this includes to some extent myself, have consciously steered around using type annotations and/or asynchronous programming. That's not the case in what I'm doing right now, but there are definitely some cognitive complexity and difficulties with them, and there's a whole lot you can do, in the language of 2003. But there's reasons to use these things. In some ways, the Python community has become divided along these technical lines, creating sub-communities for different programming styles and tasks. Such fracturing happens as well around, for example, Django, which is almost a different language embedded in Python, or equally NumPy, or for pandas or polars, each of which fulfill different needs and require different ways of thinking. There's another change in this picture. It's highlighted in red with a gray background, I hope you can see. This ordinary fragment of code remains in this slide as in the last. It contains the walrus operator, that little colon equal to allow for assignments inside larger statements. Most of the Python community has given little thought to these two punctuation symbols. Perhaps you use them, perhaps you do not. They probably feel like an incidental matter of syntax, about which your feelings are not overwhelming. The discussion over the addition of this syntax was as heated and generated nearly as deep feelings as the schism of 2008. Maybe it's on a decade schedule that we need to have these schisms. While the negative tone of much of this discussion reached relatively few people, this was basically on the core Python development lists and Python ideas and a few things like that, some limited channels. While it reached relatively few people, it ultimately proved a tipping point for Guido van Rossum, the creator of Python, and the person long given the joking sobriquet benevolent dictator for life, or BDFL. After the discussion of the walrus operator, PEP 572, Guido chose, for his own mental well-being, to step down from his privileged leadership role in the Python language itself. He remains part of our community and remains active in development, but governance of the language has become more strictly procedural, rather than, that is, relying on this inspirational figure. What did this change in formal structure mean for the global community that is only loosely connected to the core contributors of this language? In a Pythonic spirit, my slides are somewhat tongue-in-cheek. Pierre Clostras's 1974 book, which is pictured and probably not terribly readable, is a brilliant critique of conventional Western anthropology, which found it, that is, Western anthropology, found it acceptable to talk about primitives and a linear progression towards more hierarchical societies. For Claustras, non-hierarchical societies have always been aware of hierarchy and always specifically resisted it rather than foreshadow it. It's not their inevitable future, says Claustras. I earnestly believe that one of the best things each of us can do to create a better Python community, and indeed a better world, is to work wherever we can to resist and undermine hierarchies. The change in Python's development and governance was not in reality an overthrow or rejection of the BDFL, but it was a change in doctrine nonetheless. Whereas we previously found security in the continuing good judgment of a single well-meaning individual with excellent intuitions about programming language design, something else became necessary. That something was not particularly non-hierarchical, but maybe just slightly less so than it was previously. A group called the Python Steering Council was created and elected yearly by a limited group of those people who are core contributors to CPython. This rotating group of 5 people must, between them, find the same wisdom in their decisions as did the BDFL for Python's first 27 years. Many of the people in this audience do not know the brief history that I've outlined in the last few minutes. I've described these, but the fact that you can all be Pythonistas and have no need to actually know this says something about the Python community, or better, the many Python communities across the world. It's not uncommon for technical communities to dissolve when their founding figures no longer lead. Python is far from alone in staying consistent through such changes, but it's not a simple given that's going to happen. In authentically open source projects, sometimes this is reflected in a fork of the project, and sometimes by simple abandonment. In corporate controlled software, even where it has an open source license, communities often die at the whims of project managers and VC capital. What led me to this talk was thinking about Emil Durkheim, and later sociologists who were inspired by him. Durkheim being, in some sense, the founder of sociology, although Auguste Comte and others are sometimes given that appellation instead. But arguably, the central concept in Durkheim's work was that the idea that communities are a proper object of study in themselves. Things are true and false about communities as such, and communities have histories and values that are not reducible to the beliefs or psychologies of their members. The title on this slide is another silly joke, of course. Neither sociology nor programming languages are so reducible nor so close to each other as my provocative lie. However, I genuinely think that a programming language is every bit as much a relevant focus for sociological analysis as is any other collection of people embedded and enshrined in specific structures of governance, belief, and doctrine. We're going to take a dark turn, as the slide indicates. As much as I truly admire the good in our communities, the very things that make them best are prone to pitfalls of group cohesion. As with other social groups, demands for inclusion can sometimes replace decency and respect for others rather than enhance it. Codes of conduct are meant to encourage cooperation and deference, but they can sometimes simultaneously attract zealots devoted to their draconian and capricious enforcement. I've cynically characterized these members of the Python community as Torquemada fanboys, after the gruesome Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. We got one person with knowing the reference who, of course, Uche does. Um, While Monty Python jokes, the one about the Spanish Inquisition, of course, are a staple of the Python community, this dig comes with discomfort rather than easy humor. The reasons obviously involve specific individuals, but they can genuinely not be reduced to the motivations and actions of those people. A descent into a miniature authoritarianism can emerge from a collective feeling of what a community means. Those who carry out purification generally believe they are acting from consensus and even from demands of the larger group. This specific negative social trend has largely destroyed the open source community around NixOS Linux distribution and has been endemic within the Scala community. It is sadly prevalent around the Django Software Foundation, and it exists in other free software communities as well. Regrettably, some specific discussions and conflicts within the PSF sphere, ongoing as of the last few weeks, ongoing right now today, about removing undesirable elected fellows, has followed this course. As I speak, I do not know what the outcome of this schism will be. We'll see. I'll talk about this in the future, obviously, as will other people. In questions or in the hallway, I can tell you more about the specific details I'm alluding to, or you can ask Aisha or Uche, who know, and some other people do. But let me do a little digression. Let me tell you a story that is both personal and it's about power dynamics. Oh, and let's have a relevant slide for it. In 2015, my life partner was a blogger for the PSF. For April Fool's Day of that year, a day where spoofs and gags are ritually prevalent in media and personal interactions, she and I made such a joke for the Python blog. Another example to note in the Python world is PEP 401, named after the date of April 1. And go look up PEP 401 after the talk. It's hilarious, and it's an interesting joke. In this brief story, we announced, my partner and I, that the North American PyCon would next be scheduled in Havana, Cuba. The bite of this joke requires an understanding of the enormous hostility US governments have maintained towards Cuba since its revolution, and the details of that are a very different long talk. However, the deadpan presentation in our blog post was largely about what a good thing it would be if that actually happened. The brief post prompted quite a bit of indignant outrage and hostility towards me. Notably, this outrage, which was very much in the spirit of misguided code of conduct complaints, came entirely from privileged white men in the United States. Mind you, I am a great deal like them demographically, and I advise everyone never to trust people who look like me or sound like me. But equally notably, my actual Cuban friends and acquaintances did not object to the joke. They felt that it was a positive, ironic gesture, and I believe understood the point that we were trying to make. One result of this incidental post was encouraging actual Cuban Pythonistas to organize a conference that was planned to be named PyCon Cuba, although they arrived at a different name in the end. And I was absolutely delighted to be one of the speakers at that conference that resulted. And I helped in this small way in growing that community. I most certainly made and retained friendships from that wonderful visit, for my own personal life, but for other people as well, extending our community into a place where it hadn't been, or it had been much less. I also retain enemies from that 2015 post. Many of those are the same people I criticized in the last slide. I'm, of course, not naming in this talk. I know that in this talk I have focused too much on the goings-on of the Python Software Foundation, a community of volunteer bureaucrats, of which I am one. For some reasons of modest budgets and grants, and because of some limited intellectual property control, the PSF is important. However, the PSF is not that important. The community of PyCon Nigeria and those of many other national and regional conferences, user groups, project collectives, and other associations of developers who love this language are every bit as important to the future of Python, as are the handful of paid staff in the United States, or even the slightly larger collection of directors who happily now mostly come from the global South. There are many continuities among our many communities, but there is also a distinctness in what each one brings. We share values around the world, but we also share differences. And much of our theology is to recognize and acknowledge both our commonalities and our variability. I painted a possible dark portrait a couple slides ago. Indeed, it happens many times in history that a group of ill-meaning people, or still worse, a group of too vehemently well-meaning people, come to control the hierarchy of broad communities. That is unfortunate when it happens. But even if the worst outcomes were to occur at that faraway originary core in the United States and the Python Software Foundation and the core contributors and etc., it would only somewhat affect the flourishing peripheries of the Python world. People in this very room could fork the free software language, and people throughout the world would continue to feel joyed in the shared avocation, profession, devotion, and capacity that Python and we people who care for each other bring to our community. Oh, I was meant to be showing you that pretty archipelago picture for the last narration, but take it in, it's a pretty archipelago. And I do love the phrase, the archipelago of communities, that a colleague of mine provided to me. And essentially, this is it. I do want to give thanks, of course, to the organizers and all the participants in this conference, but I want to thank also my wonderful, wonderful employer, Service Employees International Union, which is one of the largest, but also one of the most active and progressive unions in the United States, a little bit in Canada, getting the international just barely. Open source communities, and Python especially, reveal a libertarian, not libertarian, just strike that out, reveal a liberatory and utopian possibility for belonging. Of course, people genuinely do like the syntax, semantics, the approach to concurrency or to mutability, and so on of a language, such as Python, or other people like others. Theology doesn't vanish, but practice is tantamount. Social facts are always cogent, and identities, as e.g. a Pythonista, are often deliberately chosen identities. The values embodied in a community both attract the people to that community and shape those who belong to it, like me, like you. And I thank everyone so very much. I don't know where I am on time, but that's my comments. And people over here, do we indeed have some minutes for people to make comments, or the next speakers now?
If anyone has any questions, so bring you the mic so that people on video can hear you. Questions? Uche, me, I know you have a question.
Thank you, David. So I think your whole idea of how communities start in one way, and they develop, and sometimes if they're successful, like the Python community, they form local branches like this. I'm curious about, you've been here for a couple of days observing this community and observing, how this community is developing. I'm curious if you have any sort of thoughts on how, regardless of all the history, regardless of all the other politics in the Python community, from what you're seeing, how can this community continue to grow and nurture, its ability to, keep doing good things with Python.
Um, I mean, I've only been here in Nigeria a couple days, and I've had a chance to talk to some of you, and I hope to more. But there really is this amazing warmth and vitality amongst the people here, where there really is, it seems like a feeling of shared sense of mission and shared purpose and shared love, which brings us together. And I've certainly seen that in other places in the world, but it seems especially to be the case where there are fairly new communities. I mean, I love going to PyCon US, which is a very large conference, and I know, it would be exaggeration to say half the people there, but I mean, I walk down the hallway and I know a great number of people, and that's wonderful. But in some sense, the core has become calcified. I mean, it's still a nice place to be, but I feel like it's so much more important to the world and to possible good values that people like you, people from the global south, people who are learning Python for the first time, people who are enabling economic and cooperative and hopefully non-hierarchical communities, um, anew are what really is the future of this programming language, of free software, of open source, of a chance to work together for a broad social good. I mean, there's social goods that aren't about programming languages too, of course, but I really do believe that this is one of them. This is something important to our world.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I'm speaking on behalf of. I'm asking my question on behalf of. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm asking my question on behalf of Black Python devs. We are a non-profit organization, which we're also building our communities also, and we're established in the US also. And I would like to ask a major question: how did you think, or how do you feel growing the community would be for us? Specifically, how reaching out to people and getting fame from every other communities, like from bigger communities to smaller communities, going into places where specifically might not be Python, but the major thing is we want to understand. I want to hear your view on how you grow your communities.
Um, I mean, I can say something, but in a way, I think this is more a question for you. I mean, I love the creation of Black Python devs, and I think I'm spacing his name, Miller. What's his? Jay Miller. Great apologies, Jay, who's a wonderful person and founded this along with some collaborators. But I think that that group and groups like it, whether you're reaching, on the basis of excluded identities, or whether you're reaching out on the basis of, fields like medicine you mentioned that aren't necessarily the same as programmers, I think that it's incumbent on you to shape that community and make it something worthwhile. I don't want to be a, messiah for. Even if my skin color was different, I wouldn't want to be that. Um, but I do think that's an opportunity to create a good and authentic community that, of course, derives from, Black Python devs has the word Python in it. There is some connection there, but you can make it something different or something more as well.
Anybody has a question? May I have a... Okay, so my question and comment is, I mean, for us local organizers, I like to say local organizers, I mean, I don't like the politics of the PSF. I didn't. That's not why I came for the community, the politics. I came to make impact, to be local, to be on the ground where actual impact actually happens. And some of the work we do, it's like if one person here gets influenced, guess what? They go back and they influence 50 other people who in turn influence another 150. Now the challenge I'm having is, and that was why we wrote the Python, the letter from Python Africa. If you guys haven't read, there's a blog post that Python Africa wrote, like from different Python communities in Africa, different countries. We wrote a letter to the PSF because it felt like our events was being discriminated on. We're being underfunded. We're being compared to likes of like Sweden and the US, but their culture is different. So, for example, if we ask for funding Tanzania, they will say somebody on the PSF board will say, um, Tanzania doesn't support LGBTQ, so we're not sure we're going to approve the grant. You cannot compare your international laws with the local laws. You cannot tell us as a local organization or as a local community that we must conform to US standards. We're not operating in the US. We're just operating locally and we're bound by the local laws and regulation. I am not the country of Nigeria. If Nigeria legislators have not approved something, there is nothing I can do about it. And cannot go on the streets and be carrying placard that we must support some excluded people rights. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. And if anything, anybody here who comes to the Python community, even if Nigeria has that law, we never discriminate here. We are here because of Python. So some of my frustration, and that's why I want your advice. I know that was a long comment. Some of our frustration is how do we change that narrative of that impact where it feels like we're being forced, like the US or the white, or like the, I don't want to say white, I don't want to be racist or anything, but like people in abroad or people internationally don't understand our challenges, but they try to impose on us, and so that we don't have to keep writing letters before something is done. And it feels like there are peculiar people who are like, no, if this country doesn't support this right, we are canceling them, and which is not fair. Like you might as well, you would cancel the whole United Arab Emirates, you will cancel many African countries because of some of those things. So what can we do as a community? How can we come together beyond writing blog posts that may or may not? I know elections are happening now. What can we do as a community to make our voices louder? To say diversity and inclusion doesn't mean we cannot be the same as US PyCon or Sweden PyCon. We are who we are. We are Nigerians. Our culture is different. Like you said, the vibe here is different. So what can we do as a collective?
Um, so work with Aisha is the first thing. She's so wonderful. But I know something about the context of what she's talking about. Uh, some of you may know, I mean, I'm sure some of you do, and some perhaps do not, but there's definitely many intersecting identities that people have. And indeed, that's much of the topic of what I talked about. But in particular, there, one of the, which is absolutely a correct belief of the United States Python Software Foundation and the Code of Conduct and Diversity and all that, has to do with gender equality and opposition to homophobia and anti-trans and a variety of rights that I sincerely and earnestly believe are essential and important. And there are many countries in the world, including this one, that doesn't enforce or respect those rights, or even does exactly the opposite. However, that is the world. And I'm not going to say that the United States, where I'm from and where I live, doesn't have just horrific horrors in its history and in its laws and in its jurisprudence and things like that either. But there's an attitude which, in my mind, and Aisha knows the names I'm not going to say, where there's a kind of arrogance of privilege that comes with that. And it's like, I want to respect a certain right, and I don't care about those others. Like, I don't care about Africa because this other thing is more important to me. And it is difficult to wrestle with these intersecting identities and these intersecting political beliefs. But for me, I can't believe that the right answer is just to have this kind of draconian standard, which I mentioned in one of my things, where if somebody's not completely perfect, or not even a person, but a nation or a society or a culture or something like that, if they're in any way imperfect relative to some particular judgment, we cast them aside. That's, to my mind, clearly the wrong way to approach global community. Yes, things should be better a lot of places. But I said this in my talk, the Python Software Foundation, we, it, Python is open source. It's a free software license. You could, if you wanted to, you couldn't use the name Python, but you could fork the whole thing tomorrow. You could create your own project. You'd have to come up with a clever other name, but so what? People come up with names. And you could keep doing everything you wanted without having anything to do with that US nonprofit. You probably couldn't use the name PyCon for conferences, and you'd have to go through me to get used to the name because I'm the co-chair of the trademarks committee. But, in the end, that's trivial. The intellectual property rights that the US PSF have they're not nothing, but they're incidental. And I think that the approach is to make other organizations, make other communities, make other juridical and organizational frameworks that simply aren't that. I'm not saying, nobody talk to the PSF and hate them and oppose them or anything like that, but, different movements and different groups can have independence. I mean, obviously money is an issue. I mean, PSF gave a little bit of money to this conference, but not a huge amount. But PSF isn't an organization with a lot of money. I mean, it has a budget of, grand total, a couple $1 million a year. And we pay some staff and we pay for the US PyCon and we give some grants to other things. But, that's 30 seconds of profit for Microsoft or something. It's not big money that we're talking about there, as much as I, have been part of that organization in various ways. It's not the world. It's not even the Python world. And, maybe there's don't call it PSF, but call it, the Python Africa Foundation or something, and, use that as a grassroots way of advancing Africa as a technical hub and as a community and there's lots of details. I don't know that exactly that is the right approach, like go incorporate in who knows which country and what laws pertain, but you're not actually restricted by this one faraway organization.
Thank you. Any more questions? Anybody? Questions?
I think, is this a question? No. Well, then I think I thank you all very much, and I am again so honored to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. So,